For 9 years, the Duke of Camden made absolutely certain that everyone in 3 counties understood exactly what he thought of Eleanor Hartley. He turned his back on her at assemblies. He forbade his own tenants from doing business with her family's small shop. He let it be known, in the particular quiet way a powerful man lets things be known without ever quite saying them aloud, that any household wishing to remain in his good favor would do well to keep its distance from the Hartley name. He was entirely right to be furious. He was wrong, as it turned out, about absolutely everything else, and the day he finally learned it, he did not sleep for 3 nights running, trying to work out how a man might possibly earn back 9 years he had spent destroying the wrong person entirely. Before we get into how it started, this is a brand new channel, and if you love watching a proud man discover he owes someone an apology considerably larger than words can carry, hit subscribe now so you don't miss whether he manages it. Now, here's how it began. Alexander Vane had been 15 years old when his father, the 8th Duke of Camden, took his own life in the estate's private study, and Alexander had spent the following 19 years of his life understanding that death, through the single, simplified story his grieving mother had given him in the immediate, unbearable aftermath, a story that named, with terrible specificity, exactly whom to blame. He remembered, with the particular clarity that trauma sometimes fixes permanently in a young mind, being the one to find his father that morning, having gone to the study to ask permission for some now entirely forgotten boyhood errand, and the 15 years that followed that discovery had been, in every meaningful sense, divided cleanly into a before and an after, a boy who had once run freely across the estate's grounds, and a young man who had learned, almost overnight, to carry himself with the careful, guarded formality he believed a duke's heir required. His father had invested the greater part of the estate's liquid fortune in a shipping venture recommended, with apparent enthusiasm and considerable personal assurance, by a family friend and man of modest business named Charles Hartley, a venture that collapsed within the year, taking with it not merely the invested capital, but the credit and reputation the old Duke had staked upon its success among his own circle of investors. The 8th Duke, already prone to melancholy and increasingly convinced he had ruined the very legacy he'd spent his life building, did not survive the humiliation of the collapse by more than 4 months. Alexander's mother, in the raw, unbearable weeks that followed, told her grieving 15-year-old son that Charles Hartley had killed his father, as surely as if he'd held the pistol himself, and Alexander, desperate for somewhere to direct a grief too enormous to simply sit with, absorbed that story whole, and never once, in 19 years, thought to question a single detail of it. What neither Alexander nor his mother ever learned, because neither of them had any reason to look past the comfortable, terrible clarity of a single villain to blame, was that Charles Hartley had not, in fact, devised the shipping venture at all, nor had he profited from its collapse by so much as a shilling. The scheme belonged entirely to Mr. Silas Grange, the 8th Duke's own long-time man of business, a quiet, meticulous steward who had served the Camden family for over 2 decades, and had, in that time, developed a considerable talent for constructing investments that appeared, on their surface, to be recommended by trustworthy, well-meaning friends, while in fact serving no purpose beyond funneling capital into accounts Grange controlled entirely himself. Grange had perfected, over years of quiet practice, a particular method of concealment, positioning genuinely respectable acquaintances of the family as the enthusiastic public face of ventures he alone had actually structured, ensuring that any suspicion which arose would naturally fall upon the friend who had made the recommendation rather than the steward who managed the paperwork behind it, a method he had used, in smaller and less catastrophic forms, at least twice before the shipping venture that finally ruined the 8th Duke, neither instance ever traced back to him at the time. Charles Hartley had been, in the truest sense, nothing more than the cheerful, unsuspecting face Grange had positioned in front of the scheme, a man whose genuine friendship with the old Duke lent the venture a credibility Grange's own name could never have carried. And Hartley had, in fact, grown suspicious of the venture's structure himself in its final months, writing a cautious letter to the 8th Duke, urging him to withdraw his investment before it was too late. A letter that Grange, intercepting the household correspondence, as he had for years, without anyone thinking to question the practice, quietly destroyed before it ever reached its intended reader. Charles Hartley had spent the remaining years of his own life, before dying of a weak heart some 6 years after the scandal, watching his family's reputation and modest fortune crumble under the weight of a blame he did not deserve and could never quite manage to disprove, since Grange, growing wealthier and more established in his own quiet retirement from the Camden household, had every reason to let the world continue believing precisely what it already believed. He left behind a widow who did not long survive him, and 3 children, of whom Eleanor, the eldest at 19 when her father died, inherited both the modest remains of the family's small shop trade and the full, crushing weight of a reputation that had been poisoned, thoroughly and permanently, by a duke's grief and a steward's careful silence. Eleanor Hartley had spent the 9 years since her father's death building, with a patience that occasionally frightened even her own siblings, a life that required as little as possible from a society that had already decided, long before she was old enough to defend herself, exactly what her family name meant. She kept the small shop her father had left behind, running through sheer, stubborn competence, developed a reputation among the more discreet corners of the county for producing fine embroidered goods that some of the very families who publicly snubbed her privately and rather shamefacedly continued to purchase, and raised her 2 younger siblings, a brother now nearly of age, and a sister just entering her own difficult years of being quietly excluded from the invitations her family name could no longer secure, with a steady, unshowy resilience that had, over 9 years, hardened into something considerably tougher than the grieving 19-year-old girl who had first watched her father's name become a byword for betrayal across the county. She remembered, with a specificity that had never once faded, the very first assembly she attended after her father's death, barely a month into her mourning, when the Duke of Camden, not yet 26 himself, and still raw with his own compounded grief over both parents' losses within a single, terrible year, had crossed an entire crowded ballroom rather than remain within speaking distance of her, a deliberate, public gesture that every soul present understood immediately, and that set, in a single humiliating instant, the precise pattern their every future encounter would follow. She had gone home that night and wept for the first time since her father's funeral, not for herself alone, but for the understanding, arriving all at once with a clarity too sharp for a 19-year-old to easily bear, that her family's disgrace was now a fixed and permanent fact of the world, sealed by a duke's public judgment in a manner no private grief of her own could ever hope to overturn. She had encountered Alexander Vane, Duke of Camden, at a considerable number of public gatherings across those 9 years, and each encounter had followed the same practiced, humiliating pattern. He would see her enter a room, and his expression would shudder, cold and immediate, and he would, without fail, find some pretext to turn his attention elsewhere within moments, a deliberate, public cut that every other guest present understood perfectly and took careful note of, since a duke's disapproval carried weight considerably beyond the man himself. Eleanor had learned, across those 9 years, to enter a room already braced for it, her spine perfectly straight and her expression perfectly composed, refusing to give him, or the watching county, the satisfaction of visible hurt, though the hurt itself had never once fully faded, layered instead beneath 9 years of careful, practiced armor. The cost of that judgment had not remained merely social. In her 3rd year of mourning, a young solicitor's clerk named Mr. Daniel Price, a genuinely kind man who had called upon the shop with growing regularity and had begun, with a shy but earnest hope, to speak of a future together, withdrew his attentions with a suddenness that left Eleanor bewildered for weeks, until she learned, through the careful, roundabout channels by which such things eventually became known in a small county, that his employer had received a quiet word suggesting an alliance with the Hartley name would do the young man's prospects at the firm no particular favors. Eleanor never confirmed with certainty that the word had come from Alexander himself, though she harbored little genuine doubt of it, and the loss, small as it might have seemed from the outside, had taught her a lesson she carried more heavily than any single public cut, that the Duke's disapproval did not merely wound her pride, but reached, quietly and invisibly, into every corner of the modest, ordinary future she might otherwise have built for herself. It was Alexander's own mother, the Dowager Duchess, who unknowingly began unraveling the story that had governed her son's entire adult life in the final weeks of her own illness that spring, when a fever confined her to her bed and left her drifting, in her more lucid hours, toward memories she had not permitted herself to examine closely in nearly 2 decades. She told Alexander, sitting beside her bed on an evening she seemed unusually clear-headed, that she had found, going through her late husband's old correspondence some years earlier, while searching for an entirely unrelated document, a partial letter in Charles Hartley's own hand, water-damaged and clearly never delivered in full, that seemed to raise some manner of caution about the shipping venture rather than championing it. "I did not think of it again for years," the Dowager Duchess admitted, her voice thin with fever, but her eyes, in that particular moment, entirely lucid. "I told myself it was nothing, some fragment of business correspondence that meant little without the fuller context I could not reconstruct. And I confess, Alexander, that some part of me did not wish to disturb the story we had both built our grief so firmly around. It was simpler to have a name to blame than to sit with the possibility that your father's ruin had no single villain at all, only an accident of trust misplaced, somewhere I could no longer trace. I have thought of that letter more often than I ever admitted to you these past years, and I find, lying here now, that I can no longer bear the thought of carrying the uncertainty of it any further, without at least telling you it exists." Alexander found the letter within the hour, in a box of his father's old papers he had not opened in years, and read it standing in the same study where his father had died, the water-stained, incomplete lines suddenly rearranging 19 years of certainty into something considerably more uncertain. He spent the following weeks, with a grim, methodical thoroughness that surprised even his own solicitors, tracing every remaining thread of the old shipping venture's collapse. And it was in the course of that investigation that he finally uncovered the full, damning shape of Silas Grange's scheme, corroborated by surviving shipping records, by a former clerk of Grange's willing to speak, once assured his own reputation would not suffer for the honesty, and by the discovery that Grange himself, now an old man living comfortably on wealth Alexander, finally understood the true origin of, had never once, in 19 years, corrected the story everyone believed. Alexander confronted Grange directly, in the modest but comfortable townhouse the old steward had purchased with money that, Alexander now understood with a cold, retroactive fury, had come directly from his own father's ruin. Grange received him in a sitting room, furnished with a quiet, tasteful comfort that struck Alexander, taking it in with new and furious eyes, as a monument built entirely from stolen grief. "I wondered how long it might take," Grange said, once Alexander had laid the evidence plainly before him, his voice carrying none of the alarm Alexander had half expected, and instead a weary, almost philosophical resignation. 19 years is rather longer than I anticipated, if I am honest, Your Grace. I had assumed some clerk or solicitor would stumble upon the discrepancy considerably sooner, and I confess I had grown, in recent years, almost complacent in the assumption that I had gotten entirely away with it. "You destroyed a man's reputation," Alexander said, his voice low and dangerous, in a way that made even the unrepentant Grange shift slightly in his chair. "You let my father die believing his oldest friend had betrayed him, and you let that friend's daughter grow up carrying a disgrace that belonged, in its entirety, to you." Grange did not deny it, once presented with the full weight of the evidence Alexander had assembled, offering instead a resigned, unrepentant explanation that he had simply seen an opportunity, all those years ago, and taken it, and that Charles Hartley's ruined reputation had always struck him as regrettable, but hardly his own personal concern, since the man himself was long dead and past caring about it. I will not insult you by pretending remorse I do not genuinely feel for a dead man's reputation, Grange said, but I will not obstruct whatever restitution you intend to make either, Your Grace. I am an old man with considerably more money than I have remaining years to spend it, and I find I have very little appetite left for fighting a battle I have, in truth, already lost the moment you walked through that door with proof in hand. Alexander left that townhouse in a state he would later struggle to fully describe. Grief and fury, and a sick, sinking guilt, all tangled together into something he had no ready name for. Understanding that he had spent 9 years punishing an entirely innocent family for a crime committed by a man who had served his own father's household with an outward loyalty for over 2 decades, while quietly bleeding it dry. He did not sleep, in any meaningful sense, for the 3 nights that followed, turning over, again and again, every single public cut he had delivered to Eleanor Hartley across 9 years, every tenant he had quietly forbidden from patronizing her family's shop, every invitation he had made certain, through the particular unspoken authority of his rank, never reached her family's door. He understood, with a clarity that frightened him considerably more than Grange's confession had, that he could not undo 19 years of a false story with a single private apology, that Eleanor Hartley had built an entire adult life around surviving the very cruelty he now needed, urgently and completely, to reverse. His first attempt, some days later, was clumsy in a manner that surprised him, accustomed as he was to command rather than persuasion. He sent flowers to the Hartley shop, an extravagant, conspicuous arrangement that arrived by his own liveried footman in full view of the street, along with a note requesting the honor of calling upon her that afternoon. Eleanor, watching the arrangement arrive from behind her own shop counter, with an expression her younger sister would later describe as colder than the winter frost still clinging to the window glass, had the flowers returned within the hour, untouched, along with a note of her own, containing precisely 4 words: I require no charity. Alexander understood, reading that curt, devastating reply, that he had made his very first attempt at amends in exactly the wrong register entirely, treating a 9-year wound as though it might be dissolved by the same casual, grand gesture he'd have used to smooth over some minor social slight among his own equals. He tried again, some days later, with considerably more care, calling at the shop himself rather than sending a footman, and found himself standing in front of Eleanor Hartley for the first time in 9 years without the shield of public distance or deliberate cruelty between them, and discovered, in that moment, that he had genuinely forgotten how to speak to her at all, having spent nearly 2 decades training himself never to address her beyond the barest, coldest necessity. I have learned the truth about my father's ruin, Alexander said, the words coming out considerably stiffer and more formal than he'd intended. And I have come to tell you that your father was innocent of every accusation my family has spent 19 years allowing the county to believe of him. Eleanor regarded him from behind her own counter with an expression of perfect, controlled composure that gave him nothing at all to work with. I am aware my father was innocent, Your Grace, she said. I have been aware of it every single day for 9 years, watching a county that never once troubled itself to ask for proof before condemning him entirely on your family's word alone. You have arrived rather late to a conclusion the rest of us reached considerably sooner. I intend to correct it publicly, Alexander said. Every soul in this county who ever turned their back on your family because of me will know, within the month, precisely how wrong that judgment was. And what, precisely, do you imagine that will restore to me? Eleanor asked, her voice perfectly level, despite the sharpness beneath it. My father is 9 years dead, Your Grace, and did not live to see a single day of the vindication you now propose to grant him at your own convenience. My mother followed him within the year, worn thin by a disgrace she did not earn. I have spent 9 years building a life that required nothing further from a county I learned, quite early, not to trust with my family's fortunes ever again. And I confess, I do not know what precise comfort I am meant to take in a public correction that arrives nearly a decade too late to spare us any of what we actually suffered. Alexander left the shop that afternoon with no ready answer to that question, and spent the following weeks understanding, with a growing and uncomfortable clarity, that Eleanor Hartley was entirely correct, that no public correction, however thorough, could reach backward and undo 9 years already spent, and that if he genuinely wished to earn something from her beyond the barest, coldest civility, he would need to offer considerably more than words, and considerably more patience than his own proud nature had ever previously required of him. He proceeded, over the months that followed, with a deliberate, methodical persistence that several of his own peers found faintly ridiculous in a man of his rank, publishing, first, a full and formal retraction of every accusation ever levelled against Charles Hartley, printed in the county's paper with his own name and seal attached, in a manner that left no soul in 3 counties any room to doubt the sincerity of the correction. He personally called upon every tenant and merchant family he had once quietly instructed to keep their distance from the Hartley name, informing each of them directly that the instruction had been founded on a falsehood he deeply regretted, and that he would consider it a personal favour, going forward, if they extended the Hartley family precisely the same courtesy any other respectable household in the county might expect. He did not, in those early months, call at the shop again, having understood from Eleanor's own words that his presence there offered her considerably less comfort than the practical restoration of her family's standing might. He worked instead, quietly and without seeking credit for any of it, to ensure the shop itself began receiving the custom it had always deserved on the strength of its own considerable quality, mentioning it, without fanfare, in conversations with acquaintances whose patronage he knew would matter, and declining, pointedly, to accept any thanks when those same acquaintances later remarked upon the excellent quality of goods they'd discovered at a small shop they'd apparently overlooked for years. It was Eleanor's younger brother, Thomas, now 18, and newly apprenticed to a respectable solicitor's office through an opportunity that had, Eleanor slowly came to understand, opened itself rather suspiciously soon after the Duke's public retraction, who first suggested to his sister that perhaps the Duke's efforts deserved somewhat more consideration than the cold, unbending distance she had maintained since his first clumsy attempt with the flowers. "He has not called here in 3 months, Nell," Thomas pointed out one evening, over their modest supper, "and yet half the county's better families have suddenly rediscovered your embroidery in that same span of time, and I have, myself, been offered an apprenticeship I have no earthly reason to believe I secured purely on my own modest merits. I am not asking you to forgive him. I am only asking whether a man doing this much work, without once asking anything of you in return, is perhaps not quite the same man who cut you at every assembly for 9 years running." Eleanor did not answer her brother directly that evening, though his observation lodged itself, unwelcome and persistent, in the same careful, guarded part of her mind that had spent 9 years refusing to let Alexander Vane's presence disturb her composure. She found herself, in the weeks that followed, watching for evidence of his continued efforts, with an attention she resented in herself, even as she could not quite stop giving it, noting the growing, genuine warmth with which former acquaintances now greeted her at the few public gatherings she still attended, noting the particular, careful absence of the Duke himself from any of them, as though he had deliberately withdrawn his own presence from her orbit entirely, rather than risk making his amends feel, even remotely, like a demand for her company in return. There was a particular evening, some 4 months into that quiet campaign, when Eleanor found herself unexpectedly seated beside the Dowager Duchess herself at a small charitable gathering the older woman's continuing recovery had only just permitted her to attend, and the 2 women, thrown together by nothing more than the arrangement of the seating, fell into a conversation neither of them had anticipated. The Dowager Duchess spoke, With a frankness her illness seemed to have stripped of its old careful reserve, of her own guilt in the matter, admitting that she had known of the water-damaged letter's existence for years before ever mentioning it, and that she had let her own comfortable grief take precedence over a truth she might have uncovered considerably sooner had she only possessed the courage to look at it directly. "I do not ask your forgiveness on my son's behalf," the Dowager Duchess told her. "Only your patience, if you find you have any left to spare for either of us. I have watched him work at this, these past months, with a diligence I confess I did not entirely believe him capable of, and I think, whatever else you decide, you should know it is not performed for an audience." "He does not know I am telling you any of this." Eleanor turned the conversation over for days afterward, unsettled by the discovery that Alexander's efforts had continued in corners she was never meant to witness at all, a fact that sat considerably heavier against her carefully maintained doubt than any gesture performed directly in front of her ever could have. It was nearly 6 months after his first visit to the shop that Alexander finally called upon her again, and this time he did not arrive with flowers, nor with any grand gesture at all, but simply with a single, worn letter he placed carefully on the counter between them, the very letter his mother's fevered memory had first uncovered, her father's own cautious, water-damaged handwriting still legible across the surviving lines. "I thought you should have this," Alexander said. "Not the retraction, which the county has already read, but this, in your father's own hand, warning my father precisely the caution he tried and failed to offer before Grange ever intercepted it. I have kept a copy for my own family's records, but the original belongs to yours, and I should have brought it to you the very first week I found it, rather than arriving first with flowers I ought to have known meant nothing at all against 9 years of silence." Eleanor picked up the letter with hands that were not, she noted with some private surprise, quite as steady as she would have liked, and read her father's own careful, cautious words for the first time in 9 years, a message he had written trying, in his own quiet way, to protect a friend from a danger he had only partly understood himself. She was quiet for a long moment, the shop around them holding the particular hush of an ordinary afternoon suddenly made extraordinary, and when she finally looked up at Alexander, something in her carefully maintained composure had, for the first time in 9 years of his presence, genuinely cracked. "You have spent 6 months," she said slowly, "asking nothing of me at all." "I did not believe I had any right to ask for anything," Alexander said. "I still am not entirely certain I do. I only knew that I could not undo 9 years by demanding you forgive me for them on any schedule convenient to my own comfort, the way I once demanded, without a single thought for what it cost you, that the whole county share my grief on precisely the terms I decided it required. I have simply been trying, as plainly and as patiently as I know how, to become the sort of man who deserved, eventually, to be allowed back into a single ordinary conversation with you, without expecting it to be granted before I'd actually earned it." Eleanor set the letter down with careful, deliberate gentleness, as though it were considerably more fragile than the worn, water-stained paper actually was. "I am not yet certain what I feel toward you, Your Grace," she said, "beyond the fact that it is considerably less simple than the anger I have carried, quite comfortably, for 9 years. I would ask, if you are willing, that you continue calling here, not with grand gestures, but simply as you have today, and allow me the time to discover, at my own pace rather than yours, whether the man standing in front of me now is someone I might eventually wish to know." He agreed, and did precisely that, calling at the shop with a quiet, unhurried regularity over the months that followed, content, for the first time in his proud, commanding life, to let another person set the entire pace of his own hopes, without once pressing for more than she chose to offer. Eleanor found, across those months, that the careful armor she had built across 9 years did not dissolve all at once, but eroded slowly, conversation by conversation. In the particular, unglamorous way, real trust generally rebuilds, rather than the grand, sweeping reconciliation either of them might once have expected. There was an afternoon, some months into that slow rebuilding, when Alexander arrived to find Eleanor's younger sister, Margaret, in tears over an invitation that had, for the first time in years, actually arrived for her. A summer assembly some of her old school friends were finally permitting her to attend, and yet Margaret possessed nothing suitable to wear and no funds to remedy it. The family's modest means stretched thin enough already by Thomas's apprenticeship expenses. Alexander said nothing in the moment, offered no grand gesture, but Eleanor discovered, some days later, that a bolt of fine muslin had arrived at the shop, addressed not to herself, but directly to Margaret, accompanied by a plain note explaining only that the fabric had been purchased in bulk for the estate's own household needs, and a length remained surplus, an obvious and rather transparent fiction that allowed Margaret to accept the gift, without the discomfort of understanding it, as charity. Eleanor recognized the careful, deliberate kindness of the gesture for exactly what it was: a man who had learned, finally, precisely how to give without demanding gratitude in return, and it was that small, unremarkable act, considerably more than the letter or the public retraction before it, that finally began softening something in her she had not expected to soften at all. It was nearly a full year after his mother's fevered confession first set the whole truth in motion that Alexander finally asked her, standing in the same shop where she had once returned his flowers untouched, whether she might consider becoming his wife, and Eleanor, considering the question with the same careful, deliberate honesty she brought to everything, told him that she would, provided he understood she was accepting the man who had spent a year proving himself, and not the memory of the Duke who had once, for 9 long years, made absolutely certain the whole county understood exactly what he thought of her. They were married that autumn at the same small parish church where her father had once worshipped, and Alexander, standing at the altar, watching Eleanor walk toward him in a gown of her own family shop's finest embroidery, understood that he had, and 9 of those years punishing an innocent woman for a crime that had never once been hers to answer for, and that whatever years remained to him would need to be spent, in some quiet, ongoing way, still earning the trust he had once so carelessly destroyed. Mr. Daniel Price, the young solicitor's clerk whose own courtship had quietly withered under the weight of Alexander's old influence, attended the wedding as well, now married himself to a woman he plainly adored, and sought Eleanor out during the wedding breakfast to offer his sincere congratulations, along with a small, private confession of his own that he had always suspected, without ever having proof, precisely why his employer's warmth toward him had cooled so abruptly all those years ago, and that he was glad, whatever the old hurt had cost them both, to see the truth finally set right. Eleanor thanked him with a genuine warmth that surprised her own new husband, watching the exchange from across the room, and understood, watching Price return to his own wife's side, that some of the smaller wounds of those 9 years might never be fully undone, only accepted as the particular, permanent cost of a truth that had arrived considerably too late to spare everyone involved. Silas Grange, informed some months later of the marriage and of the full, formal restitution Alexander had arranged for the Hartley family's original losses. Restitution that included not merely the return of the original invested capital, with considerable interest, but the establishment of a modest trust for Thomas and Margaret's futures, was reported to have grown considerably quieter in his comfortable retirement, understanding, at last, that the debt he had spent 19 years assuming permanently settled had, in fact, simply been waiting for the truth to finally catch up with it. He lived out his remaining years in a diminished, watchful quiet, avoided by the very county he had once moved through with such comfortable, unexamined confidence, a fate Alexander found himself thinking of only rarely, having discovered that his own energies were considerably better spent on the family he had finally, after 19 years of grief mistaken for certainty, learned how to build rather than destroy. If watching a proud man learn that some apologies have to be earned in years rather than moments left you satisfied, you know exactly what to do. This channel is brand new, and every subscriber genuinely helps us keep telling stories like this one, So if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss the next release. Give this one a like if you think Eleanor made him work exactly hard enough for it. Share it with someone who loves a slow, patient redemption story. And let me know in the comments whether you'd have forgiven him even that quickly.